Go ahead, she said into the phone, voice sharp enough to cut glass. He just shut off the water for the entire street. The pipes groaned empty behind my walls, that hollow metallic hiss echoing through the house like something alive had just been starved. I didn't move. My hand rested on the shut-off valve, fingers still warm from the turn, copper biting cold against my skin. Out front, I could already hear the distant wail of sirens building, faint at first, then rising like a storm rolling in across flat Texas pavement. Linda Whitmore stood at the edge of my driveway, one hand on her hip, the other gripping her phone like it was a badge, her perfectly styled hair barely moving in the late afternoon heat. She wasn't looking at my house. She was looking at the street, at the neighbors stepping out onto their porches, confused, curious, already forming sides. He's interfering with a shared utility, she snapped, pacing now, heels clicking against concrete in tight, controlled bursts. This is HOA property. He has no right. I leaned back against the frame of my garage, the smell of dry dust and hot asphalt settling into the air now that the faint scent of running water was gone. That smell used to be constant here, a low mineral note carried through every faucet, every sprinkler head ticking across manicured lawns. Now there was nothing. Silence where pressure used to live. I glanced once at the small brass plate bolted beside the valve box, half hidden under a layer of sun-faded paint and time. Most people never noticed it. Linda definitely hadn't. The sirens got louder. She smiled when she heard them. That tight, satisfied smile people get when they think authority is about to back them up. Yes, officer, please hurry, she added into the phone, her voice softening just enough to sound reasonable, concerned, rehearsed. I could see it all playing out in her head already. Me getting a warning. Maybe a citation. Maybe worse. Control restored. Order maintained. That's what she always called it. Order. I let out a slow breath, tasting the dryness in the air, feeling the stillness settle deeper into the house behind me. Every pipe, every joint, every inch of that line sat exactly where it had for years, unchanged, unmoved, and more importantly, unshared. She turned toward me then, eyes narrowing, the performance dropping just for a second. You've gone too far this time, she said, lowering the phone slightly but not hanging up. You can't just decide to cut people off. I didn't answer. Not yet. Because the truth was, I hadn't decided anything today. This moment had been building for weeks. Every notice she'd taped to my door. Every fine she'd signed her name to. Every time she said the word community, like it meant ownership. The sirens pulled onto the block, red and blue lights washing over the identical rows of houses, bouncing off windshields and polished mailboxes. Doors opened. Radios crackled. Authority had arrived, just like she wanted. I pushed off the garage frame and stepped forward, finally taking my hand off the valve behind me. The metal clicked softly as it settled into place. Locked. Final. Linda straightened, lifting her chin, ready to hand over her version of the story. What she didn't know, what she had never once stopped to check, was that the line she was screaming about, the one she just reported as a shared utility, wasn't shared at all. The first cruiser rolled to a stop right in front of my mailbox, tires crunching over gravel like it had every right to be there, and the engine idled low, steady, controlled, the complete opposite of the tension hanging in the air. The officer stepped out, calm, measured, one hand resting near his belt, eyes scanning the scene the way people do when they know there are two stories waiting to collide. Linda moved fast, heels clicking as she closed the distance, already talking before he even reached the sidewalk. Officer, thank God you are here, she said, voice smooth now, polished, like she had practiced this tone in front of a mirror. He shut off the water supply. The entire block is affected. This is a shared system. It is a violation of HOA regulations and city code. She pointed at me without even looking, like I was just another problem she had already solved. The officer glanced at me, then at the houses behind her, then back at the street where a few sprinklers had stopped mid-rotation, frozen in place like someone hit pause on the neighborhood. Sir, he said, stepping closer, not aggressive, just direct, did you shut off a water line? I nodded once, slow, deliberate. Yes, I said, my voice even steady. I shut off my water. The word "my" hung there for a second, barely noticeable, but I saw the slight shift in his expression, just enough to tell me he heard it. Linda did not. She laughed, short and sharp. Your water feeds the community line. She cut in, stepping between us now, inserting herself like she always did. We have documentation. This affects multiple properties. He cannot just turn it off. I let the silence sit for a second, long enough for the wind to push a loose flyer across the street, long enough for the officer to look past her again. Really look this time. Do you have access to the shutoff? He asked me. I turned slightly and gestured toward the open side of my garage, where the valve box sat partially in shadow, the metal lid leaning against the wall. It is on my property, I said. Installed when the house was built. Permitted. Inspected. The officer walked a few steps closer, crouching slightly to look at the setup, his fingers brushing the edge of the box, reading the small stamped markings most people would ignore. The sun caught the brass plate for a second, just enough to make the engraved letters visible. Private service line. He did not say anything right away, just stood up slowly, turning back toward Linda, who was already shaking her head. That is not correct, she said quickly, her voice tightening again. The HOA maintains all utilities in this subdivision. It is part of the covenant. He is interfering with shared infrastructure. The officer tilted his head slightly, not arguing, just thinking. Ma'am, he said carefully. Do you have documentation that shows this line is part of a shared system? Linda hesitated. Just for a second. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. It is implied, she said, then firmer, louder. This entire development operates as a unified system. I could feel the air shift again, subtle but real, like pressure changing before. A storm breaks. Another vehicle pulled up behind the cruiser, city markings on the door, a man stepping out with a clipboard already in hand. The inspector. Right on schedule. I crossed my arms, leaning back slightly, letting the moment stretch. Because this was the part she never planned for. Not the call. Not the accusation. The verification. The part where someone actually checks. The inspector walked up, flipping through a folder as he approached, eyes already scanning addresses, parcel numbers, utility maps. We got a report about a possible utility interference, he said, more to the officer than anyone else. Which property are we looking at? Linda stepped forward again, eager, confident, pointing straight at me. That one, she said. He shut off water that serves multiple homes. The inspector followed her finger, then looked down at his paperwork, then back at the ground, tracing something invisible beneath the surface with his eyes. I watched him pause, just for a second. The same second I had seen before. The kind that only happens when reality does not match the story someone just told. The inspector did not answer right away, just crouched down near the edge of my driveway, one hand pressing against the warm concrete as he leaned in closer to the valve box, flipping a page on his clipboard with his thumb, the paper making that dry snapping sound in the quiet. The neighborhood had gone still now, like everyone understood something was about to shift. No sprinklers, no running hoses, no background hum of water pressure anywhere. Just wind brushing through trimmed hedges and the faint ticking of cooling engines. He traced a line on his map with the tip of his pen, slow, precise, then looked up toward the street, eyes moving from house to house like he was following something buried underneath all of it. What is your address, sir? He asked without looking at me directly. I gave it to him. He nodded once, then tapped the paper again. Parcel ID matches, he muttered, almost to himself. Linda stepped closer, arms crossed tight now, her confidence starting to sharpen into something brittle. This is unnecessary, she said, her voice pushing harder than before. We have already established that the system is shared. The HOA has jurisdiction over all utilities in this subdivision. The inspector finally looked up at her, not annoyed, not impressed, just steady. Ma'am, I am not seeing that here, he said, turning the clipboard slightly so the officer beside him could see. This line runs directly from the municipal main to this property only. There is no branch connection feeding other lots from this service point. The words landed quiet, but they carried weight. Real weight. The kind that does not need volume to change a room. Linda blinked, once, then again, like she was trying to process something that refused to fit into the version of reality she had built. That is not possible, she said, slower now, each word measured, like she could force it to become true if she said it right. All homes here are connected. The inspector shook his head slightly and pointed with his pen toward the curb, toward a faint line in the concrete most people would never notice. They are connected to the main, he said, calm, factual, but not through each other. Each property has its own service line. That is standard for developments built after 1995 in this county. I could hear a neighbor somewhere behind us whisper something, the low murmur of realization spreading faster than any water line ever could. The officer shifted his stance, looking back at Linda now, his tone still polite but firmer. Ma'am, if the line only serves his property, then he has the right to shut it off. Linda's hand tightened around her phone, knuckles whitening just enough to give her away. He caused a disruption, she insisted, her voice rising again, reaching for control that was already slipping. People noticed. That creates a disturbance. That is still a violation. I exhaled slowly, the dry air scraping faintly at the back of my throat, and finally stepped forward, closing the distance just enough so I did not have to raise my voice. The only disturbance, I said evenly, is the one you reported. The inspector flipped another page, scanning quickly now, his pen tapping twice against the clipboard. Actually, he added, almost casually, filing a false report about shared utilities can trigger a code review, especially if it involves claims of unauthorized control over infrastructure. Linda froze. Not visibly to most people, but I saw it. That fraction of a second where everything stopped lining up. The officer glanced between us, then back at the inspector. So what happens now, he asked. The inspector straightened up, tucking the clipboard under his arm, eyes settling on Linda with a look that had nothing to do with opinion and everything to do with procedure. Now, he said, we verify the claim she just made. The word verify hung in the air heavier than anything Linda had said all afternoon, and for the first time since the sirens arrived, she did not speak right away, her mouth opening slightly before closing again as the inspector stepped past her and walked toward the curb with quiet purpose, boots scuffing lightly against the concrete as he traced the invisible path of the underground lines with his eyes, the clipboard now tucked under his arm like something already decided. The officer followed a step behind, watching closely, while the neighbors leaned in from their driveways and porches, drawn in by the slow shift from accusation to examination. Linda finally moved, heels clicking faster now, trying to keep pace. This is a misunderstanding, she said, her voice tightening, losing that smooth edge she relied on. We have always managed these systems collectively. That is how this community operates. The inspector stopped near the edge of the street and crouched again, brushing his fingers across the small metal access cover embedded near the curb, the kind most people drive over every day without ever seeing. He lifted it slightly, just enough to expose the stamped markings beneath, then glanced back at his paperwork. City main connection, he said calmly, almost like he was reading from memory. Individual service branches from this point. No shared lateral distribution between properties. The words landed with a finality that did not need emphasis. Linda shook her head immediately, stepping closer, her shadow cutting across the open cover. That cannot be, right? She insisted, louder now, as if volume could rewrite infrastructure. Our HOA documents clearly state that utilities fall under our authority. I could hear the faint rustle of paper as she pulled something from her folder, the crisp sound of printed pages flipping too quickly. She held them up like proof, like control, like something that could stop what was already unfolding. The inspector stood up slowly, dusting his hands off against his pants before taking a step toward her. He did not reach for the papers. He did not need to. HOA documents can outline responsibilities, he said evenly, but they do not override municipal utility design or property-level ownership. The officer shifted his weight again, eyes moving between them, absorbing the difference between assertion and fact. Linda's grip on the papers tightened, edges bending slightly under the pressure. So you are saying he can just shut it off whenever he wants? She asked, the question coming out sharper than she intended. The inspector met her gaze, steady, unblinking. If the line only services his property, then yes, he said. That is within his rights. A low murmur moved through the watching neighbors, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of sound that spreads when certainty starts to crack. I stayed where I was, arms relaxed now, watching the moment settle exactly where it was supposed to. Linda looked around briefly, just a flicker, like she was checking for support that was no longer there, then turned back, her voice dropping slightly, more controlled but edged with something else now. Then why did multiple homes lose pressure? She asked, reaching for anything that still made sense in her version of things. The inspector glanced down at his notes again, flipping one page back, then forward, the paper snapping softly. Temporary pressure fluctuation, he said. When a line closes, there can be a brief redistribution in the system. It stabilizes quickly. He looked up again, his tone unchanged. That does not make it a shared line. The explanation was simple, clean, irrefutable. Linda's shoulders stiffened, the papers in her hand lowering just slightly as the weight of that answer settled in. The officer took a small step forward, his voice calm, but more direct now. Ma'am, you reported interference with a shared utility, he said. Based on what we are seeing, that does not appear to be the case. The words were careful, but the meaning was clear. Linda inhaled slowly, the kind of breath people take when they realize they have stepped too far and there is no clean way back. The inspector adjusted his grip on the clipboard again, pen tapping once against the surface. We still need to document the report, he added, and review the claim that HOA authority extends over this line. He paused just long enough for it to register. Because if that claim is not accurate, he said, looking directly at her now, then this situation becomes something else entirely. The shift was subtle, but it was there, like pressure equalizing in a pipe after a sudden shutoff, quiet but undeniable. And for the first time since she picked up that phone, Linda Whitmore looked like someone who realized she had stepped into something she did not fully understand. Her eyes flicked down to the papers in her hand, then back to the inspector, then briefly to the neighbors watching from their driveways, and that polished confidence she carried like armor started to show hairline cracks. There has to be a mistake, she said, softer now, her voice trying to recover its balance. Our bylaws clearly state that utilities are governed by the association. The inspector did not move, just flipped another page on his clipboard, the paper snapping lightly in the still air. Bylaws can assign responsibilities, he repeated, steady and patient. But they do not change ownership or jurisdiction over physical infrastructure. He tapped the page once with his pen. And right now, your report claims interference with a shared system that does not exist at this connection point. The officer nodded slightly, his attention now fully on Linda. The dynamic no longer centered on me. I stayed back near the garage, letting the moment unfold exactly the way it needed to. The faint smell of sun-heated metal and dry soil lingering where water used to move. Linda exhaled slowly, tightening her grip on the folder until the edges bent further, the crisp lines of her paperwork no longer holding shape. Even if it is not shared, she said, choosing her words more carefully now, shutting off water creates disruption that impacts the community. The inspector glanced toward the street again, scanning the houses, the still lawns, the silent sprinkler heads frozen mid-cycle. Temporary pressure fluctuations are not violations, he said, and property owners are allowed to control their own service lines unless there is a specific restriction filed with the county. He paused, then added, I am not seeing any such restriction here. The silence that followed was heavier than before, not empty, but full of something settling into place. Linda swallowed, just enough to be noticeable if you were paying attention, and I was. We have always enforced it this way, she said, quieter now, almost defensive. That is how this neighborhood has operated for years. The inspector finally shifted his stance, squaring his shoulders slightly, the posture of someone moving from explanation to conclusion. Past practice does not override code, he said. And enforcement without legal basis can become a separate issue. The word issue lingered, carrying more weight than it sounded like. The officer stepped closer to Linda, his tone still respectful but no longer neutral. Ma'am, when you called this in, you stated that he interfered with a shared utility system, he said. Based on the inspection, that statement is not accurate. Linda opened her mouth, then closed it again, her gaze drifting briefly toward the small group of neighbors who were no longer whispering but watching, quietly, carefully, the kind of attention that does not fade once it locks in. The inspector adjusted his clipboard again, flipping to a fresh section, pen already moving. We will need to document the false claim regarding shared infrastructure, he said, and review any HOA directives that attempt to assert control over private service lines. He looked up at her again, steady, procedural. That includes notices, fines, or enforcement actions tied to that claim. I could see it land this time. Not confusion, not denial, recognition, the kind that comes a second too late. Linda's shoulders dropped just slightly, the tension shifting from outward control to inward calculation. "This does not need to escalate," she said, her voice lower, more measured, like she was trying to pull the situation back into something manageable. The inspector did not respond to that. He just kept writing, the pen scratching softly across the paper, each stroke sounding louder than it should in the quiet. I pushed myself off the garage frame and took a slow step forward, not to interrupt, just to stand where everything was visible, where the valve, the plate, the street, and the people watching all lined up in one clear line. Because this was never about the water. It was about who thought they controlled it. And now, finally, that answer was on record. The scratching of the inspector's pen did not stop, not even when Linda shifted her stance again, not even when the officer took a half step back to give space, because at this point it was no longer about control of a situation, it was about documentation, and documentation does not rush, it records. The late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the driveway, stretching the outline of the valve box across the concrete like a quiet underline beneath everything that had just been said. Linda glanced at it, just for a second, and I saw it register this time, not as a detail she could ignore, but as the center of the entire problem. "We can resolve this internally," she said, her voice measured. Careful now, the sharp edges sanded down into something almost reasonable. "There is no need to involve further review. The association can clarify its position and correct any misunderstandings." The inspector did not look up immediately, just finished the line he was writing, then closed the clipboard with a soft snap that echoed more than it should have in the still air. "Ma'am," he said, calm but final. "Once a report is filed involving alleged interference with utilities, it is no longer an internal matter." The officer nodded slightly beside him, confirming without adding anything, and that small motion seemed to land harder than the words themselves. Linda's shoulders tightened again, but this time it was not posture, it was containment, like she was trying to hold something in place that was already slipping. "I was acting in the interest of the community," she said, quieter now, the confidence replaced with something closer to justification. "We have a responsibility to maintain standards." I let out a slow breath, feeling the dryness in the air again, the absence of water pressure still lingering like a reminder of how simple the trigger had been. "Standards do not change ownership," I said, not raising my voice, not needing to. The inspector glanced at me briefly, then back at Linda. "And enforcement must be based on actual authority," he added. He reopened the clipboard, flipping to another section, the pages shifting with that same crisp sound that had been marking every step of this moment. "We will need copies of any notices or fines issued related to this claim," he said, "particularly anything asserting HOA control over private service lines." Linda hesitated again, longer this time, her eyes dropping to the folder in her hands, the one that had started the day as proof and now looked more like evidence. "Those documents are part of our internal records," she said, slower, more cautious. The inspector held her gaze, steady and unyielding. "Then you can provide them to the city for review," he replied. "Because if enforcement actions were taken without legal basis, that is a compliance issue." The word compliance settled heavier than anything before it, more official, less flexible, the kind of word that does not leave room for interpretation. A neighbor somewhere down the street cleared their throat, the sound small but loud in the silence that followed, and I could feel the attention shift again, not just watching anymore, but understanding. Linda pressed her lips together, the polished smile completely gone now, replaced with something tighter, more controlled, like she was recalculating every step she had taken leading up to this moment. "I would like to speak with our legal counsel before providing anything further," she said finally. The officer nodded, once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to anything. "You are free to do that," he said, "but the report will move forward." The inspector made another note, the pen moving with steady precision, then looked back toward me for the first time in several minutes. "You can restore your service line whenever you choose," he said. "There is no restriction preventing you from doing so." I nodded once, simple, controlled, then turned slightly toward the valve, the metal still cool where my hand had been earlier. I did not reach for it yet. Not immediately. Because the silence that followed that statement mattered more than the water itself. Linda watched me, her eyes fixed now, no longer on the officer, no longer on the inspector, but on the one thing she had tried to control and could not. The system had not changed. The rules had not changed. Only the understanding had. And that was the part she could not take back. The air stayed still for a few seconds longer than it should have, like the entire street was waiting to see what I would do next, not because turning a valve mattered, but because now everyone understood what that valve represented. I stepped toward it slowly, boots scraping lightly against the concrete, the sound small but sharp in the silence. The metal handle caught the light as I reached down, fingers wrapping around it again, familiar, controlled, nothing rushed. Linda did not say anything this time. She just watched. The inspector shifted his weight slightly, eyes following the movement, while the officer remained near the curb, arms relaxed, no urgency left in his posture. I turned the valve. The metal gave a low, solid click, followed by the faint vibration of pressure returning to the line, subtle at first, then building, like something waking up beneath the ground. A second later, the nearest sprinkler head down the street jerked back to life, sputtering once before settling into a steady arc, water catching the sunlight as it spread across the lawn. Then another, and another. The sound came back in layers, soft ticking, light hissing, the quiet rhythm of a system running exactly the way it was designed to. I straightened up, wiping my hand once against my jeans, feeling the difference immediately, not just in the air, but in the way people were standing, the way they were looking at Linda now instead of me. She shifted her stance again, the folder still in her hands, but lowered, no longer raised like a shield. "This is not over," she said finally, her voice controlled but thinner than before, like it had lost something it could not get back. I met her gaze for a second, then let it go. "It does not need to be," I said, calm, even. The inspector closed his clipboard again, sliding his pen into place with a small, deliberate motion. "We will follow up regarding the documentation," he said, looking directly at her. "Expect contact from the city office within the next few days." The officer nodded once, stepping back toward his cruiser, the situation already de-escalated in his mind, resolved in the only way that mattered. Linda inhaled slowly, the kind of breath people take when they realize the next move is no longer theirs to control. She glanced once at the neighbors, then back at me, and for the first time, there was no authority in that look, no assumption, no certainty, just calculation. She turned without another word, heels clicking again, but not as sharp this time, not as confident, each step carrying a different weight as she moved back toward her house. The inspector followed the officer toward the vehicles, paperwork secured, process set in motion, nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just the quiet start of something that would continue long after the sirens were gone. I stayed where I was for a moment, listening to the water run, steady, controlled, exactly where it belonged. The brass plate near the valve caught the light again, the engraved words still there, unchanged, unnoticed by most, but impossible to ignore now. "Private service line." I crouched down briefly, setting the metal cover back into place, the dull clink sealing it shut, not hiding anything, just returning it to where it had always been. When I stood back up, the street looked the same as it had that morning. Same houses, same lawns, same quiet order. But something underneath it had shifted. Not the pipes, not the system, just the understanding of it. And that was enough. The sirens faded first, replaced by the steady hum of engines pulling away one by one, tires rolling slow over the same stretch of asphalt that had just carried all that noise, all that urgency, and now held nothing but the quiet return of normal. The sprinkler heads kept turning, clicking in soft intervals, water catching the last of the sunlight as it arced across the lawns, controlled, predictable, exactly where it belonged. I stood near the garage a moment longer, listening to it settle, feeling the shift sink deeper into the street. Not loud, not dramatic, just permanent. Doors began to close again, one at a time, neighbors stepping back inside with slower movements than before, conversations quieter now, less about what happened and more about what it meant. I caught a few looks as they passed, not confrontational, not even curious anymore, just different, like something had been clarified that no one was going to forget. Linda's front door shut with a firm click across the street, the sound carrying just enough to mark the end of her presence without needing to announce it. I walked back toward the valve box, not to touch it, just to stand there for a second, the metal cover now sitting flush again, blending back into the concrete like it always had. For years it had been just another piece of hardware most people never noticed, part of the background, part of the system. Now it felt like a line drawn, not new, just finally visible. The late afternoon heat started to ease, a slight breeze moving through the street, carrying that familiar mix of water, grass, and sun-warmed pavement. Nothing about the environment had changed, but the control behind it had been reset, quietly, without argument. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, a short vibration against my leg. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Unknown number. I already knew what it was before I answered. Mr. Cole, a calm voice said on the other end, professional, measured. This is the city compliance office. We are following up regarding a utility interference report filed earlier today. I leaned lightly against the garage frame, watching the water settle into its rhythm again. I figured, I said. The voice paused briefly, then continued. We will need a statement confirming the condition of your service line and any prior notices you may have received from the Homeowners Association regarding utility control. I glanced toward the house, toward the small stack of envelopes still sitting on the kitchen counter inside, each one stamped, dated, signed with the same name that had just walked back across the street. I have everything documented, I said, simple, direct. Good, the voice replied. That will help clarify the scope of the review. Clarify. That word again. Clean. Precise. Not emotional, not reactive, just the process catching up to the truth. I ended the call and slid the phone back into my pocket, letting the quiet return fully this time. No sirens. No raised voices. Just the low, steady sound of water moving through a system that was finally being understood for what it actually was. I looked down once more at the spot where the brass plate sat beneath the cover, unseen again, but not forgotten, then back up at the street. Same place. Same houses. Same lines running underneath all of it. The only difference now was that someone had tried to claim control over something they never owned, and in doing that, they had handed over exactly what would prove it. 3 days later, the envelope arrived just after noon, the sharp knock of it hitting the front door breaking through the quiet hum of the afternoon like a signal that something had finally caught up. I picked it up off the mat, the paper heavier than it needed to be, stamped with city markings that did not waste time with decoration. Inside, the letter was clean, precise, written in the same tone I had heard on the phone. Findings confirmed. Private service line. No shared utility interference. The language did not argue. It settled. I set it down on the kitchen counter next to the stack of HOA notices Linda had sent over the past 2 months, each one lined with bold words like violation and noncompliance, each one built on an assumption that had never been checked. The difference between the 2 stacks was obvious. Without reading a single line, one was opinion dressed as authority. The other was authority backed by verification. Outside, I could hear the faint rhythm of sprinklers again, steady, uninterrupted, like nothing had ever happened. But things had happened. They just did not leave marks you could see from the street. Another knock came later that afternoon, lighter this time, more hesitant. I opened the door to find a different kind of presence on the porch. Not confident, not commanding, just controlled. Linda stood there, the same folder in her hands, but it looked thinner now, edges worn from being opened too many times in too few days. Her posture was straight, but it lacked the sharpness it used to carry. I wanted to inform you, she said, choosing each word carefully, that the association will be reviewing its enforcement policies regarding utility oversight. No accusation, no raised tone, just a statement. I nodded once, letting the silence sit for a second before answering. That sounds like a good place to start, I said. She glanced past me briefly, toward the house, toward the space she had tried to define without understanding. Then back at me. We may need to rescind certain notices, she added, quieter now. The word rescind hung there, heavier than any fine she had ever issued. I did not respond right away. I did not need to. She gave a small nod, like she understood that, then turned, stepping off the porch with slower, more deliberate movements than before. No sharp clicks this time. Just the sound of someone walking away from something they could not control. The street looked the same as it had every day since I moved in. Clean lines. Trimmed lawns. water moving exactly where it was supposed to. But now there was something underneath it that everyone knew, even if no one said it out loud. Control was not something you declared. It was something you proved. I stepped back inside and closed the door, the soft click settling into the quiet. The letter from the city stayed on the counter, next to the others, but it did not belong in the same category. It was not a warning. It was a confirmation. I walked back to the garage a few minutes later, lifting the edge of the valve cover just enough to see the brass plate again, the engraved words still clean under the thin layer of dust. Private service line. I let it sit there for a second, then lowered the cover back into place, the metal resting flush against the concrete like it always had. Nothing about it had changed. It had never needed to. The only thing that changed was who understood it. And in the end, that was all it took. Because she did not lose control when I shut off the water. She lost it the moment she picked up the phone and tried to claim something that was never hers.